Um, Feeling really grateful to be a part of this place, particularly this morning. What a stunning meditation we had this morning, and the music also very stirring. I know of no other place like C3, so you should go here, and apparently you do, some of you. Yeah, how rich. And I love this metaphor of the carnival too. I mean, it's kind of disturbing because you sort of like the glitz, and every once in a while it's fun to feel sick to your stomach. Um, and then there's like the morning after, you know. This morning I saw them cleaning the streets, and it's just kind of like a weird scene to see them out there just cleaning the streets. And actually, it was my first Coast Guard festival. I know you're like, oh my word, who is this person? I had heard of it over there in Grand Rapids, but yeah, quite a thing. I didn't realize that the parade route is quite territorial. Okay, I just thought, hey, you just like go down there to the parade, and no, you don't. It's got caution tape and and the blankets. People stake their territory for the fireworks apparently days before. I mean, this is a sickness, but it's a fun sickness, like I said before. Yeah, and it was actually quite amazing, and I was kind of enjoying the whole scene. Yeah, and so what do I want to talk about today? I want to talk about the title of my talk today is Kindness in the Age of Fear. And I want to say a little bit of how this talk was born, and actually how this month was born, because one of the unusual things about C3 is that it's almost all volunteer, it's a communally led organization. You too can be a part of it. And one of the things we did last month was have a roundtable discussion. We have a separate office, if you don't know, not in this building, at the offices, and we just had a lunch conversation of what do you want to be talking about? What's going on in your heart and in your mind, and that you think would be life-giving and generative and or challenging to the C3 community. And I mean, in an hour and a half conversation with 15 people, we had enough sort of topics and ideas to last for many years. And we'll probably do something else like that in the future. And part of this month came out of that conversation. What's worth talking about? And really it started off with a single word, loving kindness, which sort of got the ball rolling. What is this? Sounds very old-fashioned, loving kindness, especially these days. And what is it about kindness, and why might we want to have a discussion about that over the course of this month? And so, yeah, I wanted to talk about kindness in the age of fear. And I think the fear, goes almost without saying, although I think it's important to say it from time to time. We live in a culture that's obsessed with fear, on the right and the left, in my opinion. And it's the thing that drives our social media engine, and the cable news, and even Storm Team 8. I don't know if you're a big Storm Team 8 person, but there's always an alert like panic, it's going to be hot, or panic, the wind is going to blow. Yeah, it's called Michigan, and but we seem to have a kind of addiction to it. That's that ticker at the bottom, I keep bringing up in my talks. The Fox News alert, or whatever version, CNN, MSNBC, they all have the same panic scrolling ticker at the bottom. Be afraid. And it works. It works because fear is natural. It's okay to be afraid, because there are things that are worth being afraid of, like bears, and waves, and really cold weather when your house is not well suited for it. There are things to be afraid of. It's deep in our instinctual selves. So, and we know that. I mean, you don't have to tell a kid, all right, let's have a day of learning about fear. Here's how it works, and we'll give you some example scenarios and you can try it out. No, you're just a kid and you get afraid of things. And this instinctual side to life takes up a lot of energy. Usually when people are very afraid, they're also not often very kind. They're often not very generous. They're often not able to take in a larger perspective of life. Why? Because the energy of it takes over. That's why you can outrun a wild animal, some of them, because of this sort of shot of adrenaline. And so the media has figured this out. And I don't mean they sat around in focus groups. It just sort of happened, probably unconsciously. How do we sell you more things you don't need? I know, we'll use fear. And we'll make you afraid. And we'll make you afraid in a friendly way, too. Like, be afraid you don't have the right stuff that will give your life meaning. Afraid that your neighbors might make fun of you. And will also make you afraid about anyone that qualifies as an other. Be afraid of the other. Be afraid of the left. Be afraid of the right. Be afraid of Trump. Be afraid of before Obama. Be afraid of Hillary Clinton. Be afraid. And they're not saying that, but they're saying that, of course. It's the energy that fuels the system, and we kind of know this. So the reason why I want to talk about kindness in the age of fear is because fear is so addictive. When was the last time you heard anybody talking about kindness or being kind? Certainly it's not in our mass media. Every once in a while, like even the evening news has like a feel-good story at the end. They're almost doing this out of guilt, in my opinion. We've just scared the hell out of you for an hour, and now we're going to make you feel really good by exaggerating one person's kind act. So that's just my assessment. Not that good things aren't happening. Actually, they are happening all the time. That's the untold story. I know this from living in Israel. I used to think about this, like, there were things to be afraid of in Israel, but you know what was happening almost all the time? People were going to the grocery store, buying food, talking to their neighbors. Normal life. Good things were happening. And it's sort of the untold story, of course. So, this sort of background of fear, I think I would pose it as more of a question on us. How might we behave in light of this? And are we going to, especially if you're a progressive, liberal-leaning person, as a lot of you are, maybe not all of you, how do we not get caught up in the same sort of fear-driven panic that mainstream culture seems to be caught up in? How do we not do that? Is that even worth spending time thinking about? So, one more thing on the positive side, this sort of feel good. I just heard this statistic, and I know statistics, you can find one for any point of view these days, depending on who's funding it. But there's less war and less disease at any point in human history, just statistically. And that's surprising. In fact, you might even think that can't be true. But it seems to be true. People are living longer. And in terms of the totality of percentage of wars, it's less. That's weird. Now, we have a greater capacity to annihilate everyone on the planet. I do realize that. But that's not something that works very well if you want to sell people things using fear. Just the facts. All right, enough of that. Fear needs polarization to survive. Fear needs dualism, which I'll talk maybe a bit about next week. But it needs poles. It needs right and left. It needs good and bad. It feeds on it. And one of the things that's become obvious to me, I'm going to call the liberal dilemma, which I've brought up in several ways, subtle and not so subtle. But let's talk about the liberal dilemma. And it's actually in a Bob Dylan line. Bob Dylan says, "They tell us not to hate anything except hatred." I don't know what song that is. Someone can tell me later. Don't Google it. You should pay attention. Hate nothing except hatred, which is like a hint already in 1968, whenever that song came out, of the dawning age of postmodernism, which we put ourselves in this dilemma. Like, I hate no one except those people who hate, or hatred itself. Wait, so how does that work? Or we include all people, and we talk about ourselves that way, West Michigan's inclusive spiritual community. We include everyone. Really? Except who? Except who? See, nobody gets out of borders and boundaries. I don't care how liberal your language is. You have borders and boundaries. You have limits. They're just hard to face. They're hard to face, the limits. It's hard to face when you too are triggered, we might say, by fear. Suddenly you know your limits. Suddenly there they are. I'm not saying you operate like that all the time, but it's one of the situations we find ourselves in. And in a culture of fear, what we end up doing is going in opposite directions and isolating ourselves. And sometimes we'll do that and then using all kinds of progressive language. Are you with me so far? Have you ever done this? Yeah, I have, for sure. People I don't like to include, by the way, are like really religious fundamentalists. Why? Because I once was one. And I think those idiots, how can they be? Wait a minute. So what I'm saying is it's quite natural. It's best to be honest about it, about the dilemma we find ourselves in, rather than saying, well, I'm going to be different and not do it. We just sort of fool ourselves, kid ourselves. So how might we find a way out of this? One of the things that also inspired this talk is that at the end of May, I had a program out in Colorado through this place that I'm a part of called Animas Valley Institute. And I went out there for some training. And I drove. I decided to drive because it was way cheaper. And also it's real close. So I drove all the way to Colorado. And when I got to Denver, I still had another 8 hours to go. So Colorado's a big place. And there's something in America called the middle of America. Are you familiar with this? It's quite vast. And I happened to notice that there were a lot of red signs in various parts of the middle of the country that said something like, I couldn't quite make it out, "Make America Great Again," something like that. I saw a few of those. What was interesting to me, I had two feelings about that. I realized, wow, America really is vast, and much of it is rural. And I grew up in pretty rural Virginia, so it's not like I was like, I've never seen these before. It just occurred to me, am I going to be the kind of person that thinks, but would never say, the middle of the country should just be an island, and I have nothing in common with these people, and actually they're the problem? Really? Every farmer in Nebraska is a problem? And then you start to get into fear-based words. Is evil, immoral, backwards. Am I going to fall into that sort of trap? But it just occurred to me in a very simple way. Half of the country, if we're supposed to believe the statistics, doesn't think like me. So is that the problem? If everybody thought like me, then the world would be great, you know? That's just the part of living in a complex, contemporary social web with vastly different bioregions and ideologies. How are we going to live in an age like this? I'm telling you, I don't care who the next president is, whether it's in 2020, I forget the dates, when's the next election? And then, or 2024, you still have your neighbors, people who don't think exactly like you. How do we want to live? And I'm not saying let's not talk about difficult things, let's not talk about issues, let's not have difficult, hard conversations about philosophy and politics. I'm not saying that. I'm saying, how are we going to treat people? I mean real people. Not like caricatures we see on TV. That's all we see on TV, are caricatures. So that's what I want to talk about. That was my intro. Which is why I love this poem. What an awesome poem. An autobiography in 5 chapters. I don't know, does this sound like you? I walk down the street, there's a deep hole, I fall in, I'm lost. It's not my fault. I mean, I've never done that personally. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it, I fall in. It's still not my fault. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street, there's a deep hole. I see it is there, I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. It is my fault, I get out immediately. I walk down the same street, there's a deep hole, I go around it. I walk down a different street. This poem is such a simple and profound way of talking about what it's like to be a human being. It's a cliche. I know, I use it, I say it. Life is a journey. And most of that journey is falling into a hole and blaming somebody else. Not once, but dozens and dozens of times. And slowly, you start to realize, wait a minute, it is my fault that I keep falling into the same hole and I'm going to get out. And maybe if you're lucky enough, somewhere down the road, you find a different street to walk on. Now, my hope is that you would treat your own journey with the same grace that she is really expressing in this poem. It's okay. I'm telling you, in case you need to be told this, it's okay if you fall into a hole. It's okay if you fall into a hole many times. It really is. And there's something, the shift in the poem has something to do with some level of introspection. Wouldn't you agree? Suddenly it's like the lights come on and she says, I see it is there, I fall in, it's a habit, my eyes are open. And you suddenly realize, wait, all this time I spent blaming somebody else for the hole that I keep falling in. Now my eyes are open. That still doesn't mean it's over. You're only part way in the journey. But this is what life is like. And if this is what your life is like, which I'm assuming it is, what about your neighbor?
And you suddenly realize, wait,
in the middle of the country,
all this time,
and all of the other people that appear on television screen, they too are on a journey.
Now my eyes are open. That still doesn't mean it's over.
Obviously, they're falling in more holes than I am. But this is a different view of humanity, what she's expressing. And what it seems to require is a certain measure of inner knowledge, of looking in the mirror, of turning the gaze inward, for you to extend the same kind of grace. Which is why I put Jesus' teaching in here. This is actually a little, what did I put in there? I put Jesus' teachings gone rogue. So that's not really a book, I just made that up. But this happened to me. Where I sometimes lead trips to Israel, and one of the things that I end up talking about are is Jesus' teaching, love your neighbor as yourself, because it's not Jesus' teaching. I don't know if you knew that or not. He gets the credit for it, but he's quoting from the book of Leviticus. And Leviticus is not like a book that you're just going to want to like, hey, you know what, I don't really have anything on the shelf. You know, just how about popping through a little Leviticus? You know, there's like blood and there are goats and there's loads of rules and about what you can touch and not touch. And it's like, whoa, what is this? Right in the middle of all those rules is this, love your neighbor as yourself. So that's interesting. That's, by the way, what Ken Wilber would call states and stages. So if you think about it historically, Leviticus represents a certain stage of consciousness, very tribal, ethnocentric, very rule-oriented, priestly, hierarchical. That's a stage of consciousness. But even in a stage of consciousness, suddenly you can have a flash of a higher insight that he calls a state of consciousness, not a stage, where suddenly you realize, wait a minute, love your neighbor as yourself. It exists, by the way, in all religions. All religions are the same in the sense they contain this meme of ethnocentricity and rules. And also, in the middle of that, you have little flashes of something richer, a higher state of consciousness, like love your neighbor as yourself. And so Jesus picks up on this. And so I was going on and on, sounding awesome about how interesting this teaching is that Jesus picks up on. And someone said this exact thing to me. I said, love your neighbor as yourself. And they said, what if you don't love yourself? And I had no answer. All I could say was, that's a good question. In fact, Jung, my favorite person to quote from lately, he says that what happened to the modern person is that we fell from the ceiling of the medieval cathedral into the abyss of the self. Now, how's that for a one-liner? What he's saying is that we fell from a cathedral of meaning, of an organized worldview, and a way of relating to ourselves, to everyone else, and to the cosmos. And the medieval cathedral was a good example of them. Go look up at one. Life is ordered. You've got the devil. You have God. You have Adam. You have Eve. You have sin. You have heaven. You have hell. You have a very structured, ordered universe. If you look very carefully at the medieval cathedral, you'll see ethnic groups and where they stand. He says what happened is that we fell, probably not to ever put, Humpty Dumpty back together again, into the abyss of the self, into the labyrinth of what it means to be a human being. Instead of projecting it all out there, we suddenly had to say it's in here. What's a more simple way of saying it? Instead of the gods and goddesses being up there and the devils and demons being down there, we suddenly realize it's in the human heart. That's a psychological shift. It's such a massive shift in worldview that it's taking many, many, many decades for that to even start to sink in. So her question to me, what if I don't love myself, is really a radical question. That requires the very thing that I'm describing, which is to look into the abyss of oneself. How I treat myself, how I think about myself, is directly related to how I see the world. If I think about myself in certain ways, I'm going to think about the world in certain ways. If I can accept the fact that I'm on a journey, like this poem describes, and I fall into a hole from time to time, and I start blaming everybody, and eventually I come to the realization that I can go on another street. If I can treat myself that way, then I have a chance of treating someone else that way. If I don't, I won't do it. That's what we call doing, when people say doing the work or doing, so-and-so is really doing their work. What they're really saying is they're looking in the mirror. They're looking in the mirror in more honest, leveling, and humbling ways. And, some of the more gross examples we can guess, like, do you remember that group? I'm sure they're still around. Remember the Westboro Baptist group that would protest everything from like funerals to whatever? They were just constantly protesting and putting actual hatred on signs. God hates you, things like that. Very shocking, repulsive sort of things, at least in my view. To put that in the context of what Jung is talking about and what this woman's question was like to me, there is a direct relationship. If you cannot accept yourself, if you cannot love yourself, you will hate other people. If you cannot accept that being a human being means I too am complicated. I too, what's Walt Whitman say? Do I contradict myself? What's he say? I contain multitudes. Yeah, if you can't say that of yourself, then you're going to look at the world and blame everybody else. They're the problem. That group is the problem. If we could get rid of them, everything would be clean and pure like it's supposed to, and then God would be happy. That's a failure to do some self-examination, to love yourself. And love doesn't mean like, oh, I just have really good warm feelings about myself. No, love is hard. It's difficult. Love is looking into the face of contradictions and inconsistencies and choosing it anyway. So before we can ever get to kindness, I think a certain measure of, can I be kind to my own story? If I can't, there's the invitation. There's the invitation to work. And the moment you get closer to that, I think you're beginning to come out of the hole that you fell into. Or, as she says, my eyes are open. I know where I am. I get out immediately, she says. All right. Maybe another way of saying it, you are on a journey. Would you agree with that? You're on a journey? They are on a journey. See, it's harder than it sounds. So make it even easier. I'm on a journey. Oh, I'm on a journey. Yes, I'm on a journey. And they are on a journey. Yeah. Yeah. So there you can see how difficult it is. At least it is for me. So let me put it kind of more directly. Our capacity to love others or to be kind toward others is in direct proportion to our capacity to be kind and to love ourselves. Yep. Next week I want to talk a bit about family, because that's even harder. I'd rather love like some abstract person or a group or my neighbor than like my cousin or something like that. See, it's not so abstract. Like, that's one of the things that since we're all so addicted to mass media, we think that real life is someone on a screen somewhere, and then there's Thanksgiving dinner, and we're like, oh. By the way, just like a side note, when Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself, or really quoted Leviticus, I think right now in our era, sort of post-Jung, I think now is the era where that, the depth of that sort of teaching is now possible. I think in a pre-modern world where that teaching was born, it definitely had depth. But what they largely meant by that is, how do I treat the other? The underbelly of that is how I'm treating myself. And I think that's new territory. That's new territory for human beings. At least I think. So, what do I want to do here? I made so many notes on this that this morning I just started putting week 1 and week 2, because I'm doing 2 weeks in a row on it. Instead of trying to cram it all into 1 week, which is what I ordinarily do. Okay. Here's a quote from the Buddha. If a man or a woman is going down into a river, swollen and swiftly flowing, is carried away by the current, how can he help others across? If you are carried away by the current of your own fears and your own capacity to treat even yourself or those close to you with a measure of kindness, how can you help others cross? You can't. You're taken away by the current. That's a little like I've seen the enemy. What's that? I've seen the enemy and it's me and it's us. That's already like one step removed and it's us. No, it's me. I've seen the enemy and it's me. So I have another quote from the Buddha, and then I'm going to do something real sort of like sermon-y and give you some things to think about. Here's what the Buddha says about right speech, which if you want to know a lot about right speech, try Twitter. Speak only endearing speech. Speak only endearing speech. Nah. Speak only endearing speech. Speech that is welcomed. Speech, when it brings no evil to others, is a pleasant thing. That's the Buddha. Yeah, it's a pleasant thing. So actually, we're just beginning a conversation, month-long conversation about kindness in the age of fear. Kindness in the age of you fill in the blank. I love this because it's so, we don't really have to have a conversation of what does it really mean, endearing speech? What does it really mean, speech that brings no evil to others? That's actually not a conversation that interests me. You already know. Really, you do. We all do. So in that sense, it's kind of straightforward in terms of practice. Because kindness, I think, is practiced. It's not about being nice. Being nice is fine, but another word for being nice is just West Michigan politeness, which is like, hello, but you can see there's caution tape in this area and do not cross into my... This is where I put my chair and it's 10 in the morning and I'm having a beer, so get out of my face. But go Coast Guard, you know. It's not niceness. It's actually more like a spiritual practice, which when we think about the state of politics and the state of culture and the state of even our own small communities and just how much fear has gripped us in this particular era, a word like kindness reminds us about spirituality as a practice. How do I want to live and be in this cultural climate? I can't change that much about the cultural climate, not like in any vast way, but I can choose to be in the moment a kind person and use a kind word. So, in other words, it's not... Okay, so I'll give you some ways to practice kindness that I was thinking about this week. And this, like I said, it's going to be kind of sermon-y, so I'm really just talking to myself. Here's a nice one. I was there once, too. I was there once, too. No matter what, I was there once, too, really. I don't mean I've held all views of all things. But in terms of my inability to see the truth of my own life and other people, I was there once, too. That's called growing up. Every one of you believed and thought things at a certain point in your life that you don't believe and think now, correct? So you were there once too. That to me is the beginning of the practice of kindness. If you can start to look at other people in the same way you look at your own journey, your own story, there's a different kind of hope that emerges. It tends to kneecap a little bit the divisiveness that goes on. So you were there once too, or I was there once too. Here's another one. I'm afraid as well. It's a little bit harder to get to. Like, what's behind your anger? More anger, you might say. Righteousness. What's behind my anger? Someone's not doing what I want them to do. And what's behind that? It's fear. Most likely. It could be something else for you, I don't know. For me, for many of us, it's fear. And there's a lot of anger in our culture. A lot of anger. So can you find, I'm afraid as well? What are you afraid of? I am actually afraid. I have this in common. Let's say someone who's on the extreme right, which I am not, they're afraid of things. But I'm afraid of things too. I don't want my country to fill in the blank over here. I don't want my country. We have so much in common. We're both afraid. Yeah, so I'm afraid as well. And maybe the conversation is, what are you really afraid of? And that's, of course, where our differences can emerge. Here's another invitation toward practicing kindness. Can I face my own contradictions? Do I have them, first of all? And if you're like, I have no contradictions, that's a contradiction. So you can't get out of it. What are my contradictions and inconsistencies? Even abstract ones, like politically. Oh, I'm definitely this, but then there's this one little thing and I'm not quite that. What about my own contradictions? What about the way that I go around saying certain things, but I don't really act that way? Yeah, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. That's looking in the mirror. I'll just do one more. And this is a little bit abstract, but to me it's been helpful. And it sort of is rooted in a Ken Wilber idea that I maybe shared a few months ago. He says something that not every worldview is totally wrong. Or be more direct, no worldview is totally wrong. Now, before you move on, no worldview is totally wrong. You're already thinking of some exceptions. I know you are. No worldview is totally wrong. Because that's like saying that human being is totally wrong. Really? A worldview is a complicated thing. It's a whole web of conscious and unconscious things. So no worldview is totally wrong. Man, I'm telling you, we need more of that. We really do. If a politician started saying, actually, I don't agree with your worldview, but I'm sure some part of it is not wrong. That'd be a totally different kind of speech, correct? So no worldview is totally wrong. Here's another one, also from Ken Wilber. No worldview is totally right. Except mine. You see how narcissistic we become? You know? I know. No. So with that said, I think a way of practicing kindness that's very simple is assuming that other views have some truth. By the way, that's like, if you want to be really super postmodern and truth is a relative construct, a linguistic relative construct, that's another way of saying truth is floating around all over the place because we're putting truth in quotation marks, which is a very sort of progressive thing to do anyway. So let's own it. Let's assume, we're not talking about ultimate truth. Let's leave that conversation aside for a second, but let's assume other views have some truth. Is that possible? You know what I would like? People who disagree with me to do that for me. Wouldn't that be nice? Hey, there must be some truth, something that we have in common in your worldview. I would love to be treated that way. And of course, it's the right's fault for not treating me that way. And I'm in a hole. And it's not my fault. It's their fault. So that's what I'm saying. This is a very I'm talking about your actual neighbors. I'm talking about the people that you interact with on a daily basis. Is it possible to assume that other views have some truth? And what would it look like to learn about that? You'd have to start asking some questions, correct? What is it like to be you? Tell me why you think this way. What's your story? What was it like? What things happened to you that helped formulate this way of viewing the world? Help me understand that. Even if at the end we say, whatever, agree to disagree or something like that. That is now humanity at its best. Tell me what it's like to be you. Or as Mary Oliver says, tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you about mine. I'll see you next week.